Joshua, to deliver the vote to be proposed.
There's no contextual reason that can explain away Edmund Burke's quote that evil flourishes when good men do nothing. Because the principle is absolute. When people are dying, something must be done. And we have shown you not only that principle moral ground justifies EU intervention, but we've gone further and shown you on a further burden that practically it is expedient as well. They've ignored the principle moral ground and only currently are fighting on practical ramifications. I'm going to take those down for you in two questions. Firstly on the idea of EU legitimacy, and secondly on the idea of the practical effects on Syria. So let me first talk about EU legitimacy. And here they've talked about why the EU shouldn't go in, because it undermines the legitimacy of the United Nations. Now this isn't true, because fundamentally, as we've already told you from Mark, the United Nations doesn't necessarily have legitimacy as the preeminent body when it comes to intervention to save lives, especially humanitarian intervention. It has a huge track record of failure. We saw it in Rwanda in 1994. We saw it not so far away in Yugoslavia in 1998. Showing that the United Nations has some kind of legitimacy doesn't principally show why the European Union shouldn't unilaterally take action based on fundamental universal moral grounds that we've proven since Annabel. In fact, we tell you that the European Union is actually going to gain legitimacy from intervention, because European countries have gained global and international legitimacy from their intervention. For example, France's intervention in Côte d'Ivoire last year in restoring peace after a coup actually caused it to gain intervention among the African, Sub-Saharan African community. NATO's legitimacy among Eastern European states went up exponentially after it intervened on behalf of Bosnians in Yugoslavia. In Macedonia, the EU came that close to solving the Greek and Macedonian problem precisely because it intervened on behalf of the Macedonians. So we see that this issue of legitimacy isn't really an issue at all, because the United Nations is a red herring in today's debate. What we're really talking about is the legitimacy of the EU to go in, its moral duty to go in, and the effects on its legitimacy if it goes in. I'll show you why it's beneficial in all three cases. But furthermore, it's not true that international law binds EU to not go in, because even under the United Nations Charter there exists a clause of the responsibility to protect, which was passed in 2009, which in itself shows that the entire international community, which are all signatories to this document, show that sovereignty is not an absolute construct, because sovereignty does not, contrary to what they believe, belong to governments or regimes. Sovereignty belongs to the people within countries, which is why territorial sovereignty is respected in order for them to be able to actualize their own aspirations within their country. Once that ability to do so within that country is ended, the responsibility to protect document, as signed by all members of the United Nations, recognizes that sovereignty no longer plays an issue and countries are justified legally in moving in to restore that sovereignty to the people. So legally there's no reason why the EU should go in either. But even if this was the case, we think that undermining the legitimacy of the United Nations this way might be beneficial, because what it does is that it sends a message to other repressive regimes that they can no longer hide behind this construct of international law in order to repress their own people. In fact, we think it's even worse in their case, because international law isn't going to mean squat to anyone, because international law is the precise thing that dictators are using to repress their people. We don't think that they do much for legitimacy of the UN, the legitimacy of international law, or the legitimacy or the morality of human life at all. But then they've talked about how it's not legitimate because EU countries are going to be dragged in. Now this isn't true, because the European Union and NATO forces are number one voluntary, so there's no issue of countries being dragged in involuntarily. In fact, contributions to the EU army are proportional, budget is proportional. So this practical tier doesn't stand at all. Then they've talked about how citizens in Europe are not going to agree. Well, I'm sorry, governments in the EU have a mandate which comes to the ballot box. Citizens hold their, it doesn't make sense for citizens to hold their governments hostage on crucial issues like intervention. Governments are elected precisely to make these kind of decisions which are time sensitive. So if citizens are voting in their governments through a trustworthy contractual agreement through the ballot box, there isn't any issue why governments should have the responsibility to enact policies during their time in office. It doesn't make sense for them to say that a government choosing to do something isn't justified because its people during that time of inaction of that policy don't agree. If you don't agree, vote them out in the next election. There's no legal basis why they shouldn't go in. Then they talk about how it's expensive. Firstly, that's not true, because military technology already exists. within the Europe and within NATO, that kind of military technology that already exists is not going to cost more to procure even more. Furthermore, it's on a gradated scale. But even if it doesn't, we don't think that there's any principal reason, it doesn't negate a moral responsibility for the European Union to move in. Lastly was this idea about tensions with China and Russia. Well, if they've already considered these tensions already exist within the UN and within other geopolitical contexts, then we don't think that them intervening in Syria is going to make that much of a difference in terms of these geopolitical tension issues. In fact, they did it even before, when the European Union freeze the accounts of Hosni Mubarak, who is one of Russia's satellites in the Middle East. But it's even worse in their case, because the European Union is going to lose diplomatic clout among the Middle Eastern people, with whom it is one of the foremost peace brokers. In the Arab League, they don't turn to America, they don't turn to Russia, they don't turn to China, but look, the official mediator between the Arab countries is the European Union. That is precisely because of the way it has positioned itself, it has the most diplomatic clout to go in. This idea of foreign policy and diplomatic clout doesn't stand. I'm moving on to my second question for today, after proving to you why the EU principally, legally has justification to go in, morally has justification because of the loss of life, and diplomatically has justification as well. So I'm moving on to my second question for today about the effects on Syria. Now they've talked about how Assad will wage an all-out war. Now we don't think this is the case because clearly EU forces are overwhelming. The Syrian military remains organized, but let's face it, the last time they actually were funded by a foreign power was during the Cold War. We think that that's pretty outmoded technology. Go ahead.
So they currently have one of the top 10 biggest armies in the world, which is supplied by Russian chemical weapons and Chinese military things such as tanks. What do you
Well, I'm sorry, sir. The last time I heard anything about an unconventional Syrian weapon was when it had a nuclear technology program which has been bombed by Israel. I don't think that, number one, you're going to be able to give us any kind of empirical evidence for that, and number two, we've already shown you how their military funding has been cut off since 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. But even if that was the case, Assad is already diplomatically holding the world hostage with the lives of his people. He's already done it time and again, even with Kofi Annan's latest call for a ceasefire, with him holding his own people hostage. The only way to break that cycle of holding his people hostage and having their lives forever in the shadow of possible massacre is if we take a positive action now to move in and intervene in Syria. Since the opposition has already united against Assad, now is the best time, or rather February was the best time, to break his hegemony. The unity of the Syrian National Council was seen in the fact that at the time in February when it was calling for intervention, it was made up of 7 parties who had popular support. And mind you, these just weren't any 7 parties. These were 7 parties that represented not only the minorities of the Druze and the Shias, but they were also majority parties that represented the Sunnis. So we think that precisely because Assad's brutality has united Syrians against him, we think it's the best time and the best justification to go in. Because that means, number one, you're not going to have the problem of that kind of political fallout, that kind of governmental black hole which they are talking about. And number two, you're not going to have the problem of the EU having to create a puppet government. Because clearly there's already become a viable grassroots opposition which existed in February against the Assad regime. And lastly, on the idea of killing more people, we think that the military force going in is going to equalize the asymmetry in power between the regime and the rest of the people. Not doing anything is only going to allow him to continue to exploit his military force against his own people. We think that more people dying in infrastructure damage happens in your case anyway. You haven't shown why it's better. So clearly on our side of the house, we have shown you why legally it's justified and it's expedient and it's the best for Syria and for its people as well.
The last argumentative speech of this debate will be delivered by Joe.
Ladies and gentlemen, when Side Proposition got up here today, they needed to do two things. They needed to show, firstly, that an intervention wouldn't make the situation worse, but secondly, that if they had intervened, the situation now, the situation we face today, and everything that has happened since February 2012 would have been better and wouldn't have been as detrimental to the people in that country. And they haven't shown that for a couple of reasons. But on a base level, they haven't shown it because their examples have been flawed, because their assertions have been false, and because their analysis has been shallow. And I'm going to be dealing with all three of those issues in their case by looking at two main issues. Firstly, whether or not the EU should have intervened, whether or not they have this mystical mandate to do so, and secondly, what would have happened had they intervened. So let's get right into it. And basically what they started off their debate with was telling us that the conditions were just right and that they were going to mobilize NATO in the same way they had done in Somalia. And basically what we see is that they're suggesting they're going to use peacekeeping troops to go into the situation and to make things better. But we have an inherent issue with this in terms of the nature of peacekeeping troops, and this is where I'll clash here. In the example of Somalia, ironically called Operation Restore Hope, what we saw happen was that peacekeeping troops entered the country. They disrupted what was currently happening, and after sustaining only 18 losses of people, they withdrew. And the time since then and now has seen Somalia suffer, it's seen people be harmed, and it's seen the country descend into chaos. That is the type of loss of life that is unacceptable when all you do is bring in peacekeeping troops. So following that, they then told us, well, we're going to do a similar thing to like we did in Libya. And they asserted that all that happened in Libya was that, well, you know, we made a no-fly zone. And actually what happened in Libya was that they overstepped their mandate. The UN overstepped its mandate. They didn't just create a no-fly zone, they gave the rebels supplies, and they bombed places in Libya that were controlled by Gaddafi. They used concentrated airstrikes. It was not a simple intervention, it was not about peacekeeping troops, it was about creating a wall and backing a single side. And if we look at Libya, we see that Libya isn't in a place right now where we can be grateful for what happened. Libya is in a state where they haven't transitioned, where people are fighting over power, and when there is no clear future of whether or not we're going to gain peace and prosperity in Libya's future, and we think that that's an issue. But basically, past that, and past the fact that their example just wasn't true and didn't contribute to their point, we see that they gave us two reasons for why the EU should intervene. And the first was that generally people should always try to save lives because that's important, and they didn't really give us anything more than that. And secondly, that the EU has the capability. And I'll deal with this now. Now, the first thing we'd like to say is that it's not as simple as when people are suffering somewhere in the world, you should give up everything and go and help them. That's just not how the world works. We think that if that's how the world works, it would already be being done. But further than that, we see that the EU hasn't agreed to receive the mandate of the UN. The reason we have the UN is that it can be the policeman of the world, that it can be legitimate, and that it can do things properly. We don't think that the EU should take on that responsibility. And the reasons for this are quite simple. We look at the EU at the moment, and we see that Germany, the leading country in the EU and the most economically powerful, can't even mobilize other countries to help the EU itself. And if that's the issue, we don't think that people are going to buy into helping Syria, we don't think that they want to, and we don't think that they're going to in any way. But further than that, let's look at what Syria is actually about. And what we see is that Syria has an amazingly huge army. It's been supplied by Russia, whether in a legitimate or illegitimate way, for at least 20 years. They have really sophisticated weapons, and they have good training. And it's the type of army that isn't easily reckoned with. So we're not talking about peacekeeping troops again. If you want to create change, you're going to have to meet them on their own levels and on their own standards, which means you take on an army that is powerful and extreme, and you take on a leader who doesn't care what happens to that army. We think that that's a problem. We think that it means that we're going to have a loss of life. It means that we have a long conflict. It means that we lose money. But more importantly than anything else, it means that we drag the EU into a conflict that it shouldn't be in, that it doesn't have a mandate to take part in. But further than that, they then gave us another reason later on in the debate in terms of sovereignty and why that's important. And what we point out about sovereignty is that just because the simple group of people in Syria are revolting against the government doesn't mean that the government isn't sovereign. We have to ask ourselves, who are those people? What do they want? And really what we see is that the majority of people in Syria are upset with what's happening, and they made it very clear that they want a government where the current minority, the Alawites, are turned around. They don't want a legitimate government. They want a state where the power balance is reversed, and that's what they're going for. We don't think they're fighting for democracy, and we don't think it's fair to just back people. We don't know what their motives are. We don't think that that guarantees that it's not a sovereign country. But further than that, let's look at the UN. And what we see is that if the EU did undermine the UN, we would create a situation where firstly they're undermining a legitimate veto. But further than that, we create a situation where the countries that did veto, countries that are developing, BRIC nations that are currently up and rising, are forced out of it. We think that the people who need the UN to function most are the EU. They're the people who need to maintain the legitimacy of vetoes so that when it's in their interest to veto, they can do so. And we think that when they undermine the system, it creates a precedent for Russia and China to do the same. We don't think that's good. We think it changes the power balance, and we think that it means that the EU is no longer able to use the UN in that state. But further than that, let's assume that the EU did have this mandate and that they were required to enter the country, and let's look at what would actually happen. And I've already shown you in terms of the two examples that they gave us that we don't create a system where it's just as peacekeeping troops. But let's look at why that's even further exacerbated in terms of the example of Syria. We showed you that there's already fierce loyalty from the minority group. We've shown you that they're not prepared to compromise on what they want in the country. But further than that, we think the side proposition has fundamentally misunderstood who Assad is and what he does. We're looking at a man who responds to school kids protesting in the streets by breaking out with an army. We're looking at a man who has a total disregard for life. And we're looking at a man who doesn't care what happens to his economy, what happens to his infrastructure, or what happens to his people. And I'll take you in a moment. But further than that, we're looking at a man who's self-interested. We don't think that if you just entered this country and told him that you wanted to make change and that you wanted him to listen to you, he would do that because it's not in his interest. He's a dictator, he likes his power, and he's going to want to maintain that when you enter his country, he will attack you with all the force he has.
We accept your characterization. Assad is a bad man, but this is the man you want to negotiate with to save lives?
Look, the point is quite simple. Assad is a bad man, and when you enter people into his country that he doesn't like, he will attack them, and he will increase the size of the conflict. More people die, there's greater economic loss, and there's greater economic loss in terms of infrastructure as well. And we don't think that that's good. We don't think that's something we want to strive for. But basically, what this debate then comes down to is that assuming that he was accepting this, and assuming that Assad was removed as the leader of Syria, we create a situation where there's a power vacuum, and where there are sectarian splits. We're talking about a country where a single minority and a single group of people have ruled for almost 100 years. We're talking about a country where there is no sort of concept of what democracy might be, and no ways of creating that democracy in and of itself. It's not as simple as he's gone now, let's sort of change this up and create democracy. And Josh brought you this analysis, as did Rob, but further than that, Josh also told you that you have two options. Either you create negotiations between the people and sects in the countries, which wouldn't happen because they're so opposed to each other, or you force a power into power, or you force a group of people into power. And we think that that's difficult. We think that historically speaking, it's almost impossible to choose the right army. We've seen people first force ZANU-PF into power. We've seen in Yugoslavia that they chose the royalists, and that ended up in even more conflict. We don't think it's as simple as just removing them and changing things. And further than that, we just think in general that if you can't create that long-term economic change and political change, then there's no point creating peace in and of itself, because if all you're doing is maintaining peace, you end up there for years and years and you lose your economic prosperity. Ladies and gentlemen, they needed to show us why it would be effective. They needed to show us why the EU would make a change. They haven't done either. And quite frankly, we think that at the moment the best is yet to be for Syria. That is what they should be fighting for. We don't want a situation where things are made worse. Thank you.
We, as the EU, don't have a principled reason to invade. There is no principle upon which we should intervene in a country. We have to show you the practical benefits and the practical harms were incurred by this intervention. Even if there was a principle involved in this intervention, we don't think that the EU is the country that has to take on this intervention and that principle. So let me show you in 2 phases why we think that the side today that has proved to you which would have the best result today, the 14th of April, which would be better off under opposition or proposition. Let's go look at first of all the people on the ground and Syria itself. So there are 3 levels here: military, on the ground, and then political. So first let's look at the military level. And there have been 3 sort of back and forth lines from side proposition in this debate. First of all, they talked about peacekeeping troops, and we think that we dismissed that quite easily. Then they said, well, then we have a possibility for full-scale war. And we told you that would be really, really bad for the people in Syria because of the might of Assad's army, because of the fact that he's actually supplied, whether legitimately or illegitimately, by Russian weapons and by Chinese things like that. And we think that we showed you that full-scale war would be really bad in that regard. And then they sort of went on to this idea of, okay, we're going to do no-fly zones and occasional strikes. And we told you why, first of all, that oversteps any sort of mandate in terms of what peacekeeping and intervention is. But moreover, we don't think that those no-fly zones actually harm Assad, actually incentivize him to stop fighting and to be just be nice to his people and just start negotiations. In actual fact, we think he's incentivized to simply kill more civilians in order to get rid of the NATO troops. So we think on a military level, the EU and NATO are likely to suffer losses. Not only that, but the Syrian people are going to be caught up in this conflict and thus suffer huge losses themselves. That's particularly bad. And then we get on the ground, we say that first of all, Assad and the NATO are planning on destroying infrastructure and destroying the country itself in order to get rid of Assad. We saw NATO bombing buildings and things in Libya in order to get rid of Muammar Gaddafi, and we think that Assad has the same incentive to destroy rebel bases and to destroy things that would hurt his people, hurt the rebels themselves. We think that on an infrastructural level, that on the ground, the people's quality of life is going to be significantly worsened. But there are economic harms to this as well. We think that Assad's willing to accept those, and that's particularly bad. Not only that, but we think that on the ground, sectarian splits and terrorist interventions, like what we told you about with Hezbollah, are likely to be involved. And the people on the ground, the long and short of it is, if we were to intervene, their quality of life would be significantly lessened. That's going to be much worse than the current situation that we see, and that's going to be really bad. But lastly, let's look at political ideas. And we say that, first of all, we told you about the sectarian splits with the Sunnis and the Shias, and we think it's highly unlikely that we're just going to get this magical transition that they've been telling us about. Second of all, we asked you about the question, the possibility of the EU putting the right party in. We showed you the examples of ZANU-PF and the ANC. Thirdly, we told you about sovereignty, and they just asserted that because one group of people want the EU to be there, the sovereignty that's laid down in the Mondeo Treaty is simply no longer existent in Syria, and that's not good. And then last, we told you about the power vacuum that gets created, and that's particularly detrimental. So on all 3 of these levels, the people on the ground, the people we really care about in practice, the people in Syria are effectively screwed. But then let's look at the last people, the group of the EU. And they told us that the EU has a mandate, and that comes from a global community. And that was just an assertion. They told us the global community has this mandate. We think that that mandate is actually for the members of the UN, and that global community is the people within the UN, and that's the UN mandate. And we think that because the EU had a legitimate veto, this global community stuff just doesn't stand. Not only that, they just ignored the enormous cost to the EU that we laid out, and even if it was legitimate for the EU to intervene, we told you about these costs. They were too high. And frankly, at this stage, we've shown you we've only got the only practical solution. Not only that, but we've told you why the principle with regards to the EU stands. And frankly, at this stage, opposition just doesn't stand a chance. Thank you.
Okay, now for the final speech of the debate, Rob, and the required speech for proposition.
debate in the classroom, we lose track of what's really happening in the real world. I'm going to take you on a walk down the streets of Idlib, Homs, and Damascus in Somalia. On the streets of side opposition, statues of Bashar Assad look down on his people with a sick smile of a facade of invincibility. The same stony face was the one that ordered soldiers to machine gun civilians, the very civilians as a government he was expected to protect. There was death in their world, because they respected absolute sovereignty of a monster who puts his people against one another before he finally guns them down. We asked them, what is the basis of the sovereignty? And their response was one-sided. Law. We asked them, what law? We pointed out in Joshua that the UN Charter specifically claims the right to protect as a key tenet of the United Nations. And so they realized, oh no, we can't base it on law. So after that, we asked them, what was sovereignty based on? We told them it was based on mutual respect between governments, and this was in Annabel. Mutual respect between governments, that there should be a right to protect self-actualization for people. The problem there is that Assad fundamentally undermines that because he doesn't allow self-actualization, he shoots his own people. At the end of the day, they couldn't justify why sovereignty was legitimate. Especially when this government was anything but legitimate. This government killed its people. But then in their world, there was a global community the global community was apathetic. In the face of a massacre, they worried about whether their voter base will be happy. In the face of massacre, when they recognized massive military oppression on the people, they were worried that this same massive military might not be weaker than theirs. In the face of massive massacre, they didn't care. We said that Syria really isn't so powerful as you make it out to be. They were defeated by Israel, a military 60 times smaller than them in 4 instances. We told them that Syria's military was using weapons from Soviet era. They never responded. They simply said that the military was too imposing. And then we told them that in fact there was a track record of success by the EU, clamping down on the most vicious armies from Libya. We've given you a whole list of examples. They weren't able to clash back. They simply said, because it is too risky, we're not going to do it. Ultimately, their case was robbed of morality, and when the third speaker said that this debate is about practicality and not morality, he finally got it. Their team doesn't care. But let's look at our world. In our world, we recognize that saving lives was of utmost priority. The response in the third speaker was chilling. He said, why is saving lives a priority? Show us why. Since when has humanity ever doubted the importance of saving lives? They stand here today telling you it is not important, it's far more important that your voter base is happy. And then they said, and then after that they asked, what if the minority group doesn't want intervention? Firstly, we pointed out to them that it's clear the opposition, made up of various sects within society, agree military intervention is important. But then after that, we asked them, since when was the agreement of minority groups ever the foundation for which you base intervention and saving lives? Just because the Germans in Hitler's regime were happy because they weren't targeted, doesn't make it right that he shot and exterminated Jews. And then after that, we told them that in fact they caused more harm. They told us that we caused more harm because of infrastructural damage. We responded by telling them that at least we break the cycle of damage, we break the cycle of oppression. Our third speaker, they never responded to that either. At the end of the day, when one decides which street to walk down on, the streets of side opposition, where life is valued, where life is protected, or the streets of opposition, but they really don't care.